The family had already chosen him, but the puppy refused to leave without the one thing everyone else had forgotten. Rain pressed softly against the windows of the Carolina K-9 Rescue Center while a silver minivan waited beneath the covered entrance, its rear door open and a new blue blanket spread across the seat. Inside the adoption room, an 8-month-old German Shepherd stood at the threshold with one paw lifted. Echo was small for his age, all long legs, oversized paws, and sable fur that darkened along his back. The tip of his left ear folded slightly forward. His amber eyes moved from the waiting family to the hallway behind him. A little boy knelt beside the open door and held out a red rubber ball. "Come on, Echo," he said gently. The puppy looked at the ball, then at the boy. For 1 second, his tail moved. Dr. Emily Carter allowed herself a quiet breath. This family had visited 4 times. They had learned Echo's feeding schedule, practiced his hand signals, and spent hours sitting near him without demanding affection. Everything about the match was right. Echo stepped forward. One paw crossed the metal strip beneath the door. Then he stopped. His ears turned toward a faint sound deeper inside the building. A cabinet door closing. Keys brushing against steel. Echo backed away. He turned from the family, trotted down the hallway, and returned to the same place he always chose when adoption visits ended, the wall beside the old records room. He sat facing the painted cinder block, nose nearly touching it, body still. The boy lowered the ball. His mother placed one hand on his shoulder. No one looked angry. That almost made it harder. Emily followed Echo and crouched several feet behind him. "He is not rejecting you," she said softly. "Then what is he doing?" the boy asked. Emily watched the puppy's ears move. He was listening. Not to the family. Not to the rain. To something beyond the wall. "I do not know yet," she admitted. It was the 12th adoption Echo had refused. He never growled. Never snapped. Never hid beneath furniture. He would walk politely beside each family, accept water, and respond to simple commands. But when the time came to leave, he always returned to this wall. Staff members believed the behavior came from stress after the fire at the military training annex 6 months earlier. Echo had been found among several young K-9 candidates, too small for active work and too frightened to approach anyone wearing heavy boots. His records arrived incomplete. His black training collar was scorched along one edge. No handler was listed. No transfer papers carried a signature. Only one handwritten word appeared on his temporary intake form, Echo. The name stayed because the puppy reacted whenever metal tags clicked together in the hallway. Each time, he would rise quickly, search the doorway, then settle again when no familiar person appeared. The family waited another 15 minutes. Echo did not turn around. At last, the mother thanked Emily and led her son back toward the minivan. The boy placed the red ball on the floor before leaving. "Maybe he can keep this," he said. Echo waited until the outer door closed. Then he picked up the ball, carried it to the wall, and placed it beside his front paws. Emily sat on the floor behind him. The building grew quiet around them. Rain whispered along the gutters. Somewhere in the records room, old metal shifted with a faint scrape. Echo pressed his nose against the wall and released a sound too soft to be called a whine. Emily stood and walked around the corner to the locked storage door. Behind it were boxes recovered from the damaged training annex. Collars, blankets, identification cards, personal effects no one had claimed. She placed her hand on the knob but did not open it. Not yet. Echo appeared at the end of the hall, watching her. He touched the wall once with his paw. Then again, 2 measured taps. Emily looked from the puppy to the storage room. For the first time, she understood that Echo was not afraid of leaving the rescue center. He believed something, or someone, had been left behind. The next morning, Staff Sergeant Mason Brooks stood outside a 3rd-floor apartment in Wilmington with a cardboard box balanced against one hip and a key he did not want to use pressed between his fingers. The hallway smelled of dust, old paint, and rain carried in on other people's coats. Daniel Hayes had lived behind that door for nearly 4 years. Mason had visited often enough to know which floorboard creaked near the kitchen and where Daniel kept extra coffee filters. Yet the apartment felt unfamiliar now, stripped of the voice that had once filled it. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. Sunlight pushed weakly through the blinds, laying pale lines across stacked books, an empty dog bed still wrapped in plastic, and 2 framed photographs turned face down on the table. Mason set the box near the couch. He had promised Daniel's sister that he would sort the remaining belongings before the lease ended. Clothes to donate, military papers to seal, personal items to return. Simple tasks, if a man did not stop long enough to remember who had touched them last. Mason moved carefully through the rooms. He folded uniforms, packed books, wrapped a ceramic mug with a cracked handle in newspaper because Daniel had refused to throw it away. On the desk, beneath a training manual, he found a brochure from a K-9 development program in North Carolina. One corner had been marked with a black pen. Future plans, Daniel had written. Underneath were 2 words. Echo Project. Mason stared at the note, but did not open the brochure. Daniel had spoken about working with young shepherds after leaving the service. He had described one puppy with oversized paws and a crooked ear who copied every sound made by metal tags. Mason had listened, smiled, and promised they would visit the program together. Then the fire at the training annex ended the plan before either man could keep it. Mason reached into the inside pocket of his field jacket. The burned dog tag rested there, wrapped in a clean cloth. Its edges were darkened, the stamped letters still visible beneath the damage. Daniel Hayes. Mason had carried it since the day the recovery team placed it in his hand. He had meant to give it to Sarah Hayes, Daniel's younger sister, but every time he tried, the words failed him. The tag felt less like an object and more like a final sentence he could not finish. A knock sounded at the apartment door. Sarah entered carrying another donation box. She was 34, with Daniel's steady gray eyes and the same habit of pausing before difficult conversations. "You found the training papers," she said. Mason nodded. He talked about that puppy. All the time. Sarah placed the box down. The rescue center called last week. They received several dogs from the annex. They asked whether Daniel's personal equipment could be donated for identification records. Mason looked toward the brochure. "I have a truckload going there this afternoon," Sarah continued. "Blankets, leashes, old training gear. I thought you might take it." Mason's first answer came quickly. "I cannot." Sarah did not argue. She began folding the remaining clothes. Silence passed between them. On the table, a pair of metal tags from an old uniform shifted as she moved the fabric. The soft click made Mason's hand close around the burned tag in his pocket. Daniel's voice returned in memory, warm and certain. "Some dogs do not need a new command. They need one person who keeps coming back." Mason exhaled. "I will deliver the boxes," he said. "Then I am leaving." Sarah looked at him, but did not challenge the promise. By late afternoon, Mason's pickup rolled through the gates of the Carolina K-9 Rescue Center. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement dark and reflective. He carried the first box through the main entrance without looking toward the kennel wing. A puppy barked somewhere beyond the hallway, then fell silent. Dr. Emily Carter approached to sign the donation form. As Mason bent to set the box down, the cloth in his pocket loosened. The burned dog tag slipped free, struck the tile, and gave one small metallic note. Behind the wall, something moved at once. The metallic note crossed the hallway and seemed to hold there, small but unmistakable. Dr. Emily Carter looked down at the burned tag on the tile. Mason did not move at first. He stared at the stamped name as though it had fallen farther than a few feet. Behind the wall, claws touched the floor in a quick rhythm. Then silence. Emily turned toward the kennel wing. That was Echo. Mason bent to retrieve the tag, but before his fingers reached it, the door at the end of the hall opened. The German Shepherd puppy stepped into view. He was lean and long-legged, with sable fur dark across the back, amber eyes, and the tip of one ear folded slightly forward. A black training collar circled his neck, one edge marked by heat and age. Echo did not look at Mason's face. He looked at the dog tag. His body went still. Emily raised one hand to stop a staff member from approaching. "Let him decide." Echo took one step, then another. His paws made almost no sound against the tile. Mason remained crouched, the burned tag between them. The puppy stopped 3 feet away and lifted his nose. He drew in the scent once, slowly, then again. Mason saw the change before he understood it. Echo's ears lowered. His shoulders softened. He sat. For several seconds, no one spoke. The rescue center hummed around them with distant ventilation, water bowls shifting, and rain dripping from the roof outside. Echo leaned forward and touched the metal with the tip of his nose. Then he pulled back and looked toward Mason's chest. Mason felt Emily watching him. "Do you know him?" she asked. "No." His voice came rougher than he expected. I have never seen him. Echo lifted one front paw and placed it against Mason's chest. Once, then again. 2 measured touches. Mason froze. Daniel had used the same signal during training demonstrations with young dogs. Not a trick, not affection, a grounding command. Stay with me. Mason had seen Daniel tap his own chest twice, then wait until the dog mirrored him. He remembered laughing the first time. Daniel had said a frightened animal did not need louder orders. It needed proof the handler would remain. Echo lowered his paw, but did not move away. Mason slowly opened his hand and let the tag rest on his palm. Where did he learn that? Emily asked. Mason looked at the puppy. From Daniel Hayes. Emily's expression changed. The Marine from the annex? Mason nodded. The name seemed to reach Echo even without a command. His head turned slightly, searching the hallway. Mason hated the hope in that movement. He is not here, Mason whispered. Echo looked back at the tag, then at Mason. He stepped closer until his front paws rested against Mason's knees. He did not climb into his arms. He did not wag. He simply stayed. Emily crouched several feet away. He has refused 12 families, she said. Every time the adoption door opens, he returns to the wall beside our records room. Mason glanced toward the painted cinder block at the end of the hall. What is behind it? Storage from the training annex. Items recovered after the fire. Most were never matched to records. Echo turned at once and walked toward the wall. He stopped at the same spot where he had sat the day before, pressed his nose close, and tapped twice with one paw. Mason followed. The burned tag felt warm now from his hand. You thought he was afraid of leaving, he said. Emily nodded. I was wrong. Mason studied the wall. Echo was not hiding. He was listening. Emily unlocked the records room and opened the door. The puppy did not rush inside. He waited for Mason. That detail unsettled him more than anything else. Mason stepped through first. Metal shelves lined the room, holding sealed boxes, scorched collars, training leads, and personal items labeled with dates and partial names. Echo entered behind him and went directly to a dented gray locker in the far corner. He sat beside it and touched the door twice. Mason looked at Emily. She searched the inventory sheet clipped nearby. This locker came from Daniel Hayes's training section. Mason's hand closed around the tag. Echo rested his paw against the metal and waited. Emily found the locker key inside a sealed envelope taped beneath the inventory sheet. The label carried Daniel Hayes's name, a transfer date, and one handwritten instruction in black ink. Do not discard training materials. Mason watched her slide the key into the lock. The mechanism resisted, then turned with a dry metallic click. Echo's ears lifted. He remained seated beside Mason, close enough that his shoulder touched the Marine's boot. Emily opened the locker slowly. The smell that came from inside was faint but distinct. Old canvas, smoke, leather, and the dry dust of paper stored too long. On the top shelf lay a small black puppy collar, its buckle darkened along one edge. Beneath it rested a folded training vest, a sealed notebook, and a photograph protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. Mason reached for the photograph first. Daniel stood in the training yard beneath bright Carolina sunlight, kneeling with a much smaller Echo held against his chest. The puppy's ears were too large for his head, and one tip folded forward exactly as it did now. Daniel was smiling at someone behind the camera. On the back, he had written, Echo, 8 weeks. Watches everything. Trust slowly. Worth the wait. Mason read the words twice. Echo rose and touched the bottom edge of the photograph with his nose. He did not paw at it or make a sound. He simply stood there, breathing in whatever trace of the past remained. Emily opened the notebook. Daniel's handwriting filled the pages in careful blocks. Feeding notes. Scent exercises. Socialization records. Hand signals. Near the center, one entry had been marked with a strip of red tape. Emily read aloud. Echo does not respond well to forced contact. If he refuses a handler, do not increase pressure. Sit nearby. Leave on time. Return when promised. Mason looked down at the puppy. The 12 failed adoptions suddenly felt different. Echo had not been stubborn. He had been following the only lesson he understood clearly. Trust was not given because a door opened. It was built by the person who came back. Emily turned another page. A sketch showed Daniel's 2-tap signal beside the word "Stay with me." Echo lifted his paw and touched Mason's chest twice again. This time, Mason was ready for the gesture, but not for what had opened inside him. He saw Daniel in the apartment kitchen, laughing over burnt coffee. Daniel in the training yard, explaining that dogs remembered consistency better than promises. Daniel in the final week before the annex fire, asking Mason to visit Echo. Mason had said later. Later had become a place no one could reach. He thinks I am Daniel, Mason said. Emily shook her head. No, Mason looked at her. He responded to the tag. He responded to the tag, the training signal, and the locker. But he has watched your face since you entered the room. Dogs do not confuse people that easily. Echo sat beside the locker and looked at Mason, calm and searching. Emily continued. He knows you are not the man in that photograph. Mason tightened his grip around the burned tag. Then why follow me? Emily closed the notebook gently. Because you are carrying something connected to the person he trusted. That makes you familiar. It does not make you safe. The distinction landed harder than Mason expected. Familiar was history. Safe had to be earned. Echo moved deeper into the storage room and stopped beside a lower shelf. He nudged a sealed evidence box forward with his nose. The label read Annex Training Section, Final Recovery Log. Emily cut the paper seal and lifted the lid. Inside were printed reports, a damaged radio, and one folded statement from the emergency supervisor. Mason read the first paragraph, standing beneath the cold fluorescent light. Daniel had remained at the annex long enough to guide every adult K-9 and trainee to the assembly yard. Then he returned to check the puppy room. The final line was underlined in blue ink. Last animal transferred to safety. Male German Shepherd puppy. Temporary name Echo. Witness statement. Corporal Hayes placed the puppy into a handler's arms and said, "Do not let him think he was left." Mason lowered the page. Echo pressed against his leg, not asking to be held, only refusing to stand alone. Mason looked at the burned tag in his palm and understood that Daniel's last promise had not ended in the fire. It had been waiting inside a frightened puppy behind a locked wall for someone willing to finish it. The rescue center closed to visitors at 6, but Mason remained in the storage room long after the last family had left and the hallway lights had dimmed. Echo stayed beside him, not touching, only watching. Emily placed Daniel's notebook, the photograph, and the final recovery statement on a small table near the wall. "You do not have to decide anything tonight," she said. Mason kept his eyes on the page with Daniel's final words. He already decided something. Emily folded her arms. Daniel asked someone not to let Echo feel abandoned. That does not mean the responsibility belongs only to you. Mason looked down at the puppy. Echo had lowered himself near the table, chin resting across his paws, amber eyes open. "It feels like it does." Emily shook her head. "That is grief talking. Grief turns every unfinished promise into an order." Mason almost answered, but the truth in her voice stopped him. He had spent 6 months carrying the burned dog tag, as if keeping it close could somehow prove he had not left Daniel behind. Now Echo had recognized the tag, the signal, and the scent of the old locker, and Mason wanted to believe that meant the next step had already been chosen. But Daniel's own notes said the opposite. "Do not force. Leave on time. Return when promised." Emily checked the clock. "His evening routine begins in 10 minutes. Mason looked at her. "What do I do?" "Nothing dramatic." She pointed to a chair outside Echo's kennel. "Sit nearby. Do not call him. Do not use the tag to draw him closer. When the hour ends, leave." Mason glanced toward Echo. And then, "Come back tomorrow." The answer sounded too simple. That made it difficult. In the kennel wing, rainwater ticked from the gutters beyond the high windows. Mason sat on the metal chair with his hands resting on his knees. Echo entered the kennel and turned once on the blanket, then chose the far corner. The burned dog tag remained inside Mason's closed pocket. For 20 minutes, neither of them moved. Mason listened to the building settle. A dog shifting in the next room. A water bowl touching concrete. The soft hum of the heating system. Echo watched him without fear and without trust. At 7, Emily appeared at the end of the hall. Mason stood. Echo lifted his head. "I will be back tomorrow," Mason said. The puppy's ears moved, but he did not rise. Mason walked away. Each step toward the exit felt wrong. At the outer door, he looked back. Echo was standing now, front paws against the kennel gate. Mason wanted to return immediately. Instead, he opened the door and left. The next morning, he arrived at 8 with no gifts and no expectations. Echo sat near the back wall. Mason took the same chair. On the second day, Echo moved 2 feet closer. On the third, he brought the red rubber ball from the failed adoption and placed it halfway between them. Mason did not reach for it. On the fourth, he rolled it once across the floor. Echo watched, then carried it back. On the fifth, Mason gave Daniel's hand signal for sit. Echo obeyed. Mason tapped his own chest twice. Echo stared at him for several seconds, then turned away. The refusal hurt, but Mason remembered the notebook. Trust slowly. Worth the wait. He returned the next morning. And the next. Each time, he arrived when promised. Each time, he left on time. He never opened his pocket unless Echo was resting, and he never used Daniel's tag as a shortcut. By the end of the second week, Echo waited near the kennel door before Mason entered. He still did not climb into Mason's lap or follow him toward the adoption wing. But when Mason stood to leave on Friday evening, Echo crossed the room and touched his chest once. Mason stayed still. The puppy lifted his paw again and touched him a second time. Stay with me. Mason knelt, not close enough to trap him, only close enough to answer. I will come back, he whispered. Echo placed the red ball at Mason's knee and lay beside his boots. By the third week, Mason no longer counted the days by appointments or paperwork. He counted them by the small distances Echo chose to cross. One morning, the puppy waited at the kennel gate before Mason entered. The next, he carried the red ball all the way to Mason's chair. On another, he rested one paw across Mason's boot and fell asleep without waking at every sound in the hallway. Emily watched the changes without celebrating too quickly. Trust is not a straight line, she reminded him. He may step back. Mason understood. He had done the same thing for years. Each evening, he returned to Daniel's apartment and packed one more box. The rooms grew emptier, but the silence changed. It no longer felt like a place sealed after loss. It felt like a bridge Mason had been afraid to cross. He found more training notes inside Daniel's desk, including a list of goals written beside Echo's name. Confidence around doors. Comfort with vehicles. Choose contact, never force it. At the bottom of the page, Daniel had added one final line. A good partner should never have to wonder whether you are coming back. Mason folded the paper and brought a copy to Emily. She read it, then looked through the glass toward Echo. He is ready for the next test, she said. They moved the sessions from the kennel wing to the quiet adoption room, where Echo had refused every family before. The silver minivan was gone. The blue blanket was gone. Only the open doorway remained. Mason sat near the far wall while Echo explored the room. The puppy paused at the threshold, looked into the hallway, then returned to Mason. Do not call him, Emily said from the observation window. Mason kept his hands still. Echo approached the open door again. He stepped one paw across the metal strip, then two. His body tightened. Somewhere outside, a set of keys clicked against a belt. Echo turned sharply. For a moment, Mason thought he would run back to the records wall. Instead, the puppy looked at Mason. Mason tapped his own chest twice. Not a command. An answer. Stay with me. Echo remained in the doorway. His breathing slowed. Then he crossed into the hallway and sat at Mason's left side. Emily opened the observation door. That is the first time he has left this room without retreating. Mason looked down at Echo. What comes next? A vehicle. The following afternoon, Mason parked his pickup beneath the covered entrance. The rear door stood open. No blanket. No food. No burned dog tag placed as bait. Echo walked outside wearing a simple training harness. Rain had cleared, leaving the pavement bright beneath autumn sunlight. Mason stood several feet from the truck. Emily held the lead loosely. Echo approached the open door, sniffed the step, then backed away. Mason felt disappointment rise, but he said nothing. Echo circled the truck once. He looked through the cab, then returned to Mason and touched his chest twice. Mason crouched. I am here. Echo turned back toward the vehicle. This time, he placed both front paws on the step. His hind legs stayed on the ground. He waited. Mason did not lift him, did not pull the lead. After several seconds, Echo stepped down again and walked back toward the center. Emily smiled faintly. That was not failure. Mason watched the puppy glance over his shoulder. He did not get in. He chose to approach. Tomorrow, he may choose more. Mason returned the next day. Echo reached the step again. On the third day, he climbed halfway into the truck and sat. On the fourth, he entered fully, turned once on the back seat, then jumped out before the door moved. Each time, Mason arrived when promised. Each time, the truck waited. At the end of the week, Echo climbed in and lay down, his chin resting on the seat. Mason stood beside the open door, afraid that closing it would break the moment. Emily nodded once. Mason lowered the door gently, but did not latch it. Echo stayed. Mason reached into his pocket, removed Daniel's burn tag, and held it where the puppy could see. Echo looked at the metal, then at Mason, but did not move toward it. He no longer needed the tag to decide where safety was. Mason wrapped it again and placed it back near his heart. Echo lifted one paw and touched the seat twice. Mason understood. Not yet home, but closer. The next morning, Mason arrived before the rescue center opened and found Echo waiting at the front of his kennel with the red ball between his paws. The puppy did not bark when Mason entered. He simply stood, carried the ball to the gate, and placed it against the metal. Emily unlocked the door. "Today is different," she said. Mason looked toward the parking lot. Sarah Hayes stood beside his pickup holding a canvas duffel bag with Daniel's name faded across the side. Echo saw her through the window and became still. Sarah entered slowly, keeping her hands at her sides. She wore Daniel's old green field jacket, the sleeves rolled once at the wrists. For a moment, Echo studied her face. Then his nose lifted. He crossed the room, stopped several feet away, and drew in the scent from the jacket. Sarah's eyes filled, but she did not reach for him. "He remembers something," she whispered. Mason remained near the wall. "Maybe the jacket." Echo moved closer. He touched his nose to the cuff, then looked past Sarah toward the door, as though expecting another person to follow. No one did. The silence that came after was gentle and painful. Sarah lowered herself to the floor. "Daniel used to call me after training," she said. "He would put the phone near Echo so I could hear him chewing on everything." The puppy tilted his head at the sound of Daniel's name. Sarah smiled through her tears. "You were smaller then." Echo sat before her, but did not lean in. Instead, he looked back at Mason. Emily noticed. "He is checking whether you stayed." Mason had not moved. Echo returned to him, touched his chest twice, then walked back to Sarah. This time, he rested one paw lightly on her knee. Sarah closed her eyes. She did not hold him. She only placed her hand on the floor beside his paw. "Thank you for waiting," she said. After several minutes, she opened the duffel bag. Inside were Daniel's clean training gloves, a folded leash, and a small digital recorder. Sarah pressed the button. Daniel's voice entered the room, warm and clear despite the static. Training note, Echo, 12 weeks. He watches the exit whenever someone leaves. Do not call him back. Let him see that leaving is not the same as disappearing. Echo turned toward the recorder. His ears rose. Mason felt the room tighten around that familiar voice. Daniel continued. "He is brave when he knows where his person is. Still working on trust around vehicles. He will get there. Just do not rush him." The recording ended with the soft sound of a puppy breathing near the microphone. Echo approached the device and sniffed it. Then he searched the room again. Door, hallway, window. Mason understood what the puppy was doing. Not waiting for Daniel to appear. Confirming that the voice belonged to memory. Sarah covered her mouth with one hand. "He knows," she said. Emily nodded. "Yes." Mason looked down. "Then why did he follow the tag?" Sarah answered before Emily could. "Because Daniel taught him that familiar things can lead to safe people. Not replacements. Connections." She reached into the bag and removed a sealed envelope addressed to Mason. The handwriting was Daniel's. Mason did not open it immediately. He feared whatever waited inside. Sarah placed it in his hand. He wrote it before the training assignment. Mason broke the seal. The note was brief. "If anything happens to me, do not carry every unfinished thing alone. Find one good thing and stay with it." Mason read the sentence twice. Echo sat at his feet. Outside, sunlight moved across the wet pavement, brightening the open rear door of the pickup. Mason folded the note and placed it beside the burned tag in his pocket. Then he looked at Emily. "What does adoption require?" Emily studied him carefully. "A home visit, a transition plan, and one final choice that cannot be made by you." Mason nodded. Across the room, Echo picked up the red ball and walked toward the exit. He stopped beneath the open doorway and looked back at Mason, waiting to see whether this time the man would follow. The home visit took place 3 days later beneath a clear November sky. Mason had spent the morning removing boxes from the living room, securing the back gate, and placing Daniel's unopened dog bed near the window. He almost left it wrapped in plastic, but changed his mind. Echo did not need a monument. He needed a place that belonged to the present. Mason covered the bed with a plain gray blanket and set the red rubber ball beside it. Emily arrived just after 10 with Echo in the rear of the rescue center vehicle. The puppy stood behind the glass, alert but calm. Mason did not approach the door. He waited on the porch with his hands visible and the front entrance open behind him. Emily clipped on Echo's training lead and allowed him to step down. Echo looked at Mason, then at the unfamiliar yard. Fallen leaves moved across the grass in a light coastal wind. A delivery truck passed at the end of the street. Somewhere nearby, a lawn mower started and faded. Echo tested every sound before taking another step. Mason tapped his chest twice. The puppy watched him but did not answer. Emily handed Mason the lead without releasing her grip. "You walk beside him," she said. "You do not bring him inside. He chooses the door." They crossed the yard slowly. Echo sniffed the porch steps, the railing, and the boots Mason had left near the mat. He paused at the threshold. The house carried Mason's scent, fresh coffee, clean wood, and the faint leather smell of Daniel's training gear sealed inside a closet. Echo leaned forward, then backed away. Mason felt the old urge to persuade him. One word, one pull, one promise. He did none of those things. He sat on the porch step. Emily sat several feet away. Echo remained in the yard. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Mason watched leaves gather near the fence. "He may not enter today," Emily said. "I know." The answer came without disappointment, and that surprised him. Echo approached the steps again. He placed one paw on the first board, then another. At the doorway, he looked at Mason. Mason did not call. Echo crossed the threshold alone. Inside, he moved room by room, nose low, ears turning. He inspected the kitchen, the hallway, and the quiet bedroom where afternoon light rested across the floor. When he reached the living room, he stopped beside the gray blanket. The red ball waited there. Echo picked it up, carried it to Mason, then returned to the bed and lay down. Emily wrote something on her evaluation form. "That is a good sign," she said. Mason remained standing near the doorway. "Is it enough?" "For a visit, yes. Not for a lifetime." Echo lifted his head at their voices. Emily closed the folder. "The transition begins with short stays. 1 hour today, 2 tomorrow, then an evening. You return him on schedule every time." Mason looked at Echo. "Even if he wants to stay?" "Especially then. Trust grows when the next step matches the promise." For the next week, Mason followed the plan exactly. Echo explored the backyard, learned the sound of the refrigerator, and chose the same patch of sunlight each afternoon. He never touched the unopened closet. He slept on the gray blanket, but carried the red ball to the front door whenever the return time approached. Mason drove him back to the center without delay. Each evening, Echo watched the pickup leave. Each morning, Mason returned. On the 5th day, rain swept in from the coast and drummed against the roof. Echo rested beside Mason while he repaired a loose cabinet hinge. A clap of thunder rolled over the neighborhood. Echo stood, crossed the room, and pressed close to Mason's leg. Mason lowered one hand, but waited. Echo placed his paw against Mason's chest. Once, then again. Mason answered with the same 2 taps. The puppy settled at his feet. That evening, when it was time to return, Echo carried the red ball to the door, but did not release it. He looked toward the truck, then back at the gray bed. Mason knelt. "I promise to take you back." Echo held his gaze. Mason opened the door. The puppy followed him outside. At the rescue center, Emily met them beneath the covered entrance. Echo stepped down, walked toward the kennel wing, then stopped halfway. He turned, crossed back to Mason, and placed the red ball in his hand. Emily looked at the puppy, then at Mason. "Tomorrow is the final choice," she said. Mason closed his fingers around the worn red rubber. Echo returned to the hallway, but this time he did not face the old records wall. He sat beside the adoption door and waited for morning. Morning came bright and cold, with sunlight spilling across the rescue center floor in long golden bands. Mason arrived before the front desk opened. He carried no paperwork in his hands, no treats in his pockets, and no promise he had not already proven. Daniel's burned dog tag rested beneath his shirt, close to his heart. The red rubber ball was in his coat pocket. Emily met him near the adoption room with a folder tucked beneath one arm. "Everything is ready," she said. Mason looked through the glass. Echo sat beside the door, exactly where he had waited through the night. The puppy rose when he saw Mason, but he did not run forward. He watched. Mason entered and lowered himself onto the same chair he had used during their first quiet sessions. Echo crossed the room slowly. He stopped within reach, then looked toward the hallway leading to the old records wall. For several seconds, the past and the open door seemed to stand on opposite sides of him. Mason remained still. "You do not owe me anything," he said softly. Echo's ears turned toward his voice. Mason placed the red ball on the floor between them. The puppy touched it with his nose, but did not pick it up. Emily opened the exterior door. Beyond it, Mason's pickup waited beneath a clear blue sky. The rear door stood open. A gray blanket covered the seat. Daniel's dog tag was not hanging from the mirror. Mason had decided it should not lead Echo into the truck. This choice had to belong to the dog alone. Emily unclipped the training lead. "He can stay here," she said, "or he can go with you. No one calls him. No one guides him." Mason stood and walked outside. Each step felt heavier than the day he had first forced himself to leave the kennel wing. He reached the truck and waited beside the open rear door. Echo remained inside the center. A staff member paused at the far end of the hall. Sarah stood quietly near the front desk, wearing Daniel's green field jacket. No one spoke. Echo turned toward the records room. He walked halfway down the hall and stopped beside the painted cinder block where he had spent so many evenings listening for what could not return. He pressed his nose to the wall once. Then he looked toward the open storage door. Daniel's gray locker stood beyond it, holding the collar, notebook, photograph, and the last pieces of a life that had taught him to trust slowly. Echo sat. Mason felt his chest tighten, but he did not move. After a moment, Echo lowered his head. He touched the floor twice with one paw. Then he stood, turned away from the wall, and walked toward the sunlight. He crossed the adoption room, past Emily, past Sarah. At the outer doorway, he paused beneath the metal frame where he had once refused every waiting family. Mason did not call his name. Echo stepped outside. One paw, then another. The morning wind lifted the fur along his shoulders. He crossed the pavement, approached the truck, and looked up at Mason. The open seat was less than 3 feet away. Echo placed his front paws on the step, climbed inside, and turned once on the gray blanket. Then he lay down. Mason closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, Echo was still there. Emily brought the adoption papers to the truck. Mason signed each page with a hand that trembled only once. Sarah stood near the open door and touched 2 fingers to Daniel's old jacket pocket. "He would have liked this," she said. Mason looked at Echo. "He planned it before I did." Sarah smiled gently. Mason removed the burned dog tag from beneath his shirt. He did not place it on Echo's collar. Instead, he hung it beside the rearview mirror, where it caught the sunlight and moved with one quiet metallic sound. Echo lifted his head. He looked at the tag, then at Mason. There was recognition in his stillness, but no searching this time. Mason climbed into the driver's seat. Before he could close the door, Echo leaned forward from the back and placed one paw against his shoulder. Once, then again. "Stay with me." Mason covered the paw with his hand. "I will." The pickup rolled away from the rescue center and turned toward home. Echo watched the building disappear through the rear window, then settled his head beside Mason's arm. The red ball rested between his paws. The road stretched east beneath bare trees and clean morning light. Behind them was a locked room, an old promise, and a wall that no longer needed guarding. Ahead was a small house with a gray bed near the window, a fenced yard scattered with leaves, and a man learning that coming home could be an act of loyalty too. Echo had never refused love. He had only waited for someone who understood that trust does not begin when a door opens. It begins when someone leaves, keeps the promise, and returns.